From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. The inauguration of Texas's governor and lieutenant governor happened this week, and we're getting our first look at how state lawmakers want to spend the unprecedented amount of tax dollars they have for the state budget. Let's get to the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. When Texas lawmakers meet every 2 years, they are only constitutionally required to pass one bill, a balanced state budget. This session, they have an additional $32.7 billion to spend for fiscal years 2024 and 2025. And Wednesday, the House and Senate filed similar but slightly different budget proposals. Both chambers are proposing the state spend $130.1 billion, leaving more than $50 billion on the table. The Senate version of the budget includes $15 billion for property tax relief, including money to increase the homestead exemption to $70,000, $4.6 billion on border security operations, and $600 million for school safety initiatives. Lawmakers will spend the next few months working to pass the budget. The state's power grid was a major topic of discussion this week, starting at the governor and lieutenant governor's inauguration, where both Republicans noted that after the grid failure of 2021, it needs additional improvements to provide electricity to the state's growing population. The very next day, a report by the Dallas Fed found the grid is vulnerable to failing during extreme weather. Then on Thursday, a controversial move from the Public Utility Commission, approving a plan that will allow power generators to sell credits to electricity realtors in order to produce more power when demand is high. The idea is incentivize generators to produce more and even build more power plants. Now, the move did not go over too well with Georgetown Senator Charles Schwartner, who quickly sent a letter stating the plan is a, quote, substantial departure from the law legislators passed. The plan still needs lawmaker approval. The University of Texas and Texas A&M University made national headlines this week when university leaders followed through with the directive from Governor Greg Abbott to ban TikTok. The governor sent a letter to state agencies last month banning use of the video sharing app on all state-issued devices. Both universities blocked access to the app on campus Wi-Fi and networks. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. The governor and federal government have expressed concerns about the company sharing user data with the Chinese government. And in December, President Joe Biden also approved a TikTok ban on government devices. A spokesperson for TikTok says the bans are, quote, based on unfounded falsehoods. Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick took their oaths of office Tuesday at the state capitol. During their inaugural addresses, the state's top 2 leaders talked about their legislative priorities for the session. Patrick Sviteck, political reporter for the Texas Tribune, joined me to talk about those priorities. You know, we are still waiting for the governor and lieutenant governor to officially declare their priorities for this legislative session, but we got some insight during their inaugural addresses. So let's start with the governor. Was there anything he highlighted that stood out to you?
The main thing that stood out to me from the governor's speech was his discussion of the power grid. He seemed to acknowledge that it will be a top issue this legislative session. And that is notable because he was, very quiet about it in his reelection campaign. He's been very quiet about it in recent weeks after his reelection campaign. And that was as the lieutenant governor was very plainly saying it would be a priority for him going into this session to increase the reliability of the grid. And so to hear Abbott kind of finally acknowledge what has become obvious, that the grid is going to be a big issue, that was notable to me.
You mentioned a little bit Lieutenant Governor also talking about the grid, but what else about the things he mentioned? Because he mentioned several things in his address. What stood out to you there?
I think what stood out to me the most in his speech was perhaps how animated he got and how strongly he talked about this proposal to either eliminate or restrict tenure for public college professors if they have kind of a political viewpoint that Lieutenant Governor disagrees with. He was, I think this started out as a push to ban or to, kind of crack down on professors that teach critical race theory. But we also saw the Lieutenant Governor say in this speech that, he doesn't want Texas to have professors that, believe capitalism is bad or that believe, as he said, America is evil. And so it was somewhat of a doubling down on that promise that we've heard before to go after tenure. I'm really curious to see if that manifests itself in a serious legislative proposal this session that gets any traction.
So how do these priorities compare to Speaker of the House Dade Phelan's? We dive into that when Texas This Week continues.
From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Welcome back. This week, Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick were sworn in for their next terms of office. And during their inaugural addresses, they told Texans what they want lawmakers to accomplish this session. So, how does that compare to House Speaker Dade Phelan's priorities? Let's continue the conversation with Patrick Sviteck, political reporter for the Texas Tribune. Talking about the House a little bit, Speaker of the House Dade Phelan previously talked with reporters about, some of his priorities, even though the top bills in the House still haven't been filed yet either. But how do, the things that he wants to do, how does that compare, you think, to the governor and the lieutenant governor?
Well, I think Phelan definitely has some common ground with them. I mean, I think that he wants to focus on property tax relief with the budget surplus. He's also interested in infrastructure funding. We've heard about property tax relief and infrastructure from the governor and lieutenant governor as well. So on those big picture items, I think that they're aligned. But Phelan also has some priorities that, at least how he talks about them are a little different than how the governor and lieutenant governor may talk about the topics. Phelan, is really the only one of these three seriously talking about the issue of healthcare. And while he's not proposing anything that would be as dramatic as, expanding Medicaid, for example, he is prioritizing trying to extend postpartum care for new mothers to 12 months, which is something the House tried last session. But the Senate 1.5 to 6 months, I believe. And Phelan also talks about criminal justice reform. You heard that in his opening day speech, which is something that the governor and lieutenant governor aren't as attuned to. When you hear about them talk about criminal justice, it's the literal definition of criminal justice, kind of instilling law and order and maintaining law and order. So Phelan does have some priorities that I think are slightly more nuanced or kind of unique to his agenda than the governor and lieutenant governor do.
Last session was one of, if not the most conservative sessions in recent memory. And with a strong Republican majority this session, do you expect more of those hot button or social issues to get passed through the legislature?
I do. The question is just how far more to the right can they push after the last session when we saw these, really conservative bills related to abortion and guns, for example. We now have a virtual ban on abortion in Texas. We have permitless carry. And so the question is just what is left for them to do on some of these social issues. I thought it was pretty striking at the inauguration to hear State Senator Brandon Creighton say that this session we're going to have one of the most conservative sessions in Texas history, seeming to suggest it may be more conservative than the last one. So I think there's definitely going to be a big push when it comes to social issues to crack down on politically objectionable things being taught in the classroom. You're going to see this fight against what the Republicans call indoctrination in the classroom. I think that's one kind of new front we're going to see on social issues that maybe wasn't as front and center in 2021. So that's one area where I can see them, continuing to push farther to the right. But as I just said, on some of these issues like abortion and guns, the question is just, what is there left to do?
You can learn more about the inauguration and watch the speeches at KVUE.com. Now it is time for My Bill of the Week, our new Texas This Week segment where I highlight different pieces of legislation that catch my eye. As I was skimming through the some 2,200 bills that have been filed so far this session, I thought House Bill 24 is pretty interesting. State Representative Victoria Nieves from Mesquite is proposing all maternity clothes be tax-free in Texas. Now, if you've had a baby, you know the number of things you have to buy to prepare for and take care of that little bundle of joy add up quickly. Any savings would be a help. And because we can't ignore the obvious, especially in a state where if you get pregnant, you have to have that baby regardless of your personal circumstances. Now, Will this bill reach the governor's desk? Sorry, Rep, but I'm not holding my breath on this one. After all, we're talking about sales tax, a significant stream of the state's revenue. But it's a nice idea. I'll be following your bill's progress. That's Texas This Week. Now here's what's coming up at 9 a.m. on This Week.